I am so glad you joined me because today we're going to tackle something that I have always been curious about and just had a chance to do a lot more research about, and I want to share it with you. So, there are a bunch of confusing terms in the United States that has to do with Hispanic and Latino or Latinx and more, as you can see, uh, identification terms, and I decided that I wanted to get a deeper knowledge of that. So, a lot of this starts with the fact that when it comes to uh, being who I want to be in life, I really want to be a nice person. And in order to be a nice person, I have to make other people feel like they matter. Because if I'm interacting with someone and they don't think they matter to me, they're not going to think I'm nice. Now, in order to make somebody feel like they matter, I need to have a little bit of curiosity about them, a willingness to learn about them, and a willingness to not judge them. And I also generally have to figure out a way to understand their identity and their perception of their identity or who they feel like they are. One identity that matters to a lot of people is race and ethnicity. And that often has to do with your ancestry or your geographical background, where you lived or where your ancestors lived. That's a whole other conversation about race and ethnicity, which we are not going to cover here. But specifically in the United States, there's a lot of confusion and curiosity on my part around these terms that have to do with the Latino, Latina, Latinx, Hispanic, Latin American, Chicano, and all these other different terms and groups. Okay, so what do they mean? Generally speaking, you can make it through life with the general knowledge that Hispanic means you have some sort of background related to Spanish speaking. You might not actually speak Spanish, but somewhere in your background, people spoke Spanish, and you identify with that, and you would say that you're Hispanic. So you could have ancestry from Spain, you could have ancestry from Mexico, you could have ancestry from Panama, you could have ancestry from Chile, and you might say you're Hispanic. What's interesting about that is this is a term that is generally used in the USA. This is not generally used in other places. It was started in the USA. It had to do with the census and lots of other political things, and that's how it started. The next term is Latino. Now, Latino is a background that is generally related to coming from a country with a Latin language. And the Latin languages tend to be Spanish, Portugal, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Portuguese, I should have said, French, Italian, and a few others. But generally what it works out to is Spanish and Portuguese. So oftentimes people will identify as Latino if they come from Central or South America and a country that speaks Spanish or Portuguese like Brazil, or from the Caribbean as well. Then you get into the part where you talk about, well, what about Latina? Latina has to do with the way Spanish is spoken, specifically in America, in that male forms are O and female forms are A. So that led to the formation of Latinx, which might be used by somebody who does not like the fact that the default for saying Latino is often a male designation of Latino. And so they will say Latinx. Now, depending on who you talk to, they may or may not like this. And they could be a Latino or a Latina and not like that. They could be a Latino or Latina and like it. People like things because they like things. Now, the question is, if you want to be a nice person, what do you do? So, if I want to be a nice person, what I do is I learn to get background knowledge, and then I try not to judge others. And then when it comes to identity, I try to make sure that I listen to what the person wants. So, to make a long story short, when I'm trying to decide whether a person is Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, or any of these other things, I will simply ask them, how do you identify? And I might ask them the question why as well. All right, you could stop now if you wanted to. I'm going to go a little bit deeper. What do some of these other terms mean? So, Latin American would be somebody who has to do with these countries that we talked about before. Okay? Chicano or Chicana is actually specifically somebody who is of Mexican ancestry. Okay? Mestizo refers to the fact that many people in Central and South America and the Caribbean are a mixture of European blood and indigenous blood, and also people who were brought from Africa, the slaves that were brought. And mestizo specifically relates to usually the mixing of European and indigenous blood. Amerindian is a term which has to do with people who are indigenous to the Americas. They were already here before the Europeans arrived. So, for example, the Maya culture would be an indigenous culture, but also North American Indians who were here before Europeans arrived would also be indigenous. Latin America we've talked about already. Now we get to these concepts around Central America. So what is Central America? Central America is essentially from Mexico down to Panama. It connects the USA to South America, all those countries there. South America is from Colombia and down. And then we have Mesoamerica, which you'll sometimes read about in history books. And Mesoamerica is a portion of Central America that has to do with where generally the Mayans lived and maybe the Aztecs. That sort of talks about from the bottom portion of Mexico down to the top of Costa Rica. Then we have the Caribbean, which makes things even more confusing because the Caribbean nations have a lot of population. In fact, there are almost as many, it's approximately equal numbers of people in the Caribbean as there are in Central America. But the Caribbean or the Caribbean is not considered part of Central America. It is all the island nations in the sea, basically. And then you get to the point where North America confuses it even more because it turns out that Central America is part of North America because there's only two continents, North America and South America. And Central America, even though people there generally identify culturally more similar to South America because of the Latin America concept of speaking Spanish and the way that they were colonized and got out of colonization tends to be more similar to the Latin American countries than it does to the USA, because the way the USA and Canada got separated from England is very different. So even though Central America geographically is part of North America, culturally it is more similar to South America. And the Caribbean, I don't know if it's actually considered part of North America for sure or not, but I know that when it comes to the World Cup for soccer, the USA plays teams from the Caribbean. So it's probably mixed in with North America. Which is a long way of saying all of this confusion can be blamed on European colonization because before the Europeans came, it was all indigenous. It would be a different set of confusing things because then you would be talking about all the different tribes and ancestors and backgrounds from that way. But anyways, if you are interested in learning how I learned about this stuff to try to get less confusion, I would click on these 3 links and watch them. They are super interesting. I had a great time explaining this to you. I'm still trying to figure it out myself. And again, the most important thing when it comes to identity and being a nice person is to ask and listen and accept somebody's answer without telling them what they should believe about themselves. Thank you so much.